So today on day one, we're going to talk about how did the United States become a world power? And some of the information I wanted to get to you guys is some of the different foreign policies. So open up to page 6 in your book of knowledge. And on page 6, I want you to write these three definitions down. You have isolationism, and isolationism is no involvement with other countries. Then you have expansionism, focus on expanding the size of a nation. And then imperialism, which is the accumulation of other colonies to expand a country's wealth and power. So we're looking at the United States foreign policy during this time. And it's important for us to mention that foreign policy is how we deal with other countries. And so periodically we're going to see several things that are happening in the US as we're going to kind of go from isolationism to imperialism back to isolationism in this unit. So let me give you some background information regarding that. So, the background of our U.S. foreign policy is going to deal with these three concepts. The first one is manifest destiny. And you actually have a group of people in the United States, politicians, that are going to promote the idea of expansionism, but the expansionism and then thus imperialize. And we know that manifest destiny would have been the spreading of democracy, spread of Christianity, and this concept of the white man's burden. And remember, the white man's burden is Rudyard Kipling's poem that basically discusses that it is the white man's burden to civilize the uncivilized. This kind of relates to several things. It relates to the United States and Manifest Destiny, and it also relates to European colonization in Africa and the rest of the world. And so we kind of see the United States take this poem and kind of make it more applicable to us being imperialistic in Latin America and in Asia. Then you have a foreign policy called the Monroe Doctrine, and this is going to be pretty significant because Monroe Doctrine is when President Monroe basically says to Europe that we don't want you guys to interfere in the Western Hemisphere, like no more colonization in the Americas. And there's several reasons why he says that. Primarily, he says it because of trade. The United States is trying to grow economically, and we don't want Europeans to come into our side of the hemisphere on the earth and impact our ability to colonize and trade because we started looking towards the south. So we're looking towards the Caribbean Sea, Panama, Latin America. And so we want those raw materials for ourselves. And then also politically, we want to kind of make a stand. There's really no backup in regards to this particular foreign policy. The biggest thing about this foreign policy is that he makes this statement, and it kind of is going to lead into a couple of other things in regards to foreign policy. And then before 1890, U.S. was mostly isolationist. So we had that isolationist mindset. We weren't really kind of ready to expand our role in the world. So some of the reasons why we decide to imperialize is new resources and new markets, and then military power and political power. And so it's significant to mention the scramble for Africa. What is that? And so that is actually when the European countries, and you guys should have learned this in on-level geography or AP human geography, but basically it's where the European colonies go into the continent of Africa because of the Industrial Revolution, and they are dividing up the continent of Africa, typically sub-Saharan Africa, for their own economic gain. And that is why, one, why Monroe basically gives the Monroe Doctrine, because we see the European powers doing that, and two, we're going to kind of see some negative effects for the continent of Africa. And three, they're getting raw materials for their industrial revolution. The other thing that's happening during this time is, as I mentioned, you have several individuals that are going to be considered imperialist, or they are pushing the United States government to be imperialist. The first person would be Teddy Roosevelt. And during this time, we're kind of at a point where Teddy Roosevelt is not the president of the United States. He's just in politics. And he is going to be one of those big proponents for imperialism. Then you also have, and I just mentioned the white man's burden and Rudyard Kipling, and we're wanting to civilize the uncivilized. So spread civilization and religion to all people. Then you have another individual, Alfred Mahan. And Alfred Mahan is significant because he's gonna write a book, The Influence of Sea Power. And basically, in his book, he's going to sum it up and say that for you to be a world power, you have the biggest and strongest navy. And he is important because what he's really talking about is it's not only just having a big, strong navy, you need to have areas where your navy can stop. So you need naval bases around the world. And so for America at this time, if we wanted to be imperialistic, not only from a political and military standpoint and or for a resource standpoint, we needed what were called coaling stations around the world. And so he's basically saying that for our um, country to expand and to become a world power, we had to have one of the strongest navies. We'll talk later, but this concept actually kind of changes and shifts at the end of World War II. Well, World War I is really where we see kind of the shift in sea power is no longer significant, but definitely need to know Alfred Mahan. Then you have a senator from Massachusetts, Henry Cabot Lodge, and he is going to be another person who supports imperialism. And the biggest thing he says is it's our moral responsibility to intervene. And he's kind of talking in relation to Cuba. So we just mentioned that the Monroe Doctrine said no more European countries in the Americas. And he's really talking about Spain and some other countries that are colonizing or dealing with Latin America. And so Spain actually controls Cuba. And so we are going to actually help Cuba break free from Spanish control. And then we've mentioned social Darwinism in regards to business, but now the United States, politically, militarily, they are going to kind of take that stance as well, and that it's survival of the fittest in regards to becoming a world power. If you would flip the page now to page 8, and we're looking at our foreign policy and our presidents. So earlier I mentioned Teddy Roosevelt, and he was actually not president up until after the Spanish-American War. And so it's pretty important to mention that. But Teddy Roosevelt is actually, what he's going to do is he's going to take the Monroe Doctrine and he's going to kind of expand our international involvement or our foreign policy. So he's going to, one of the big things he says is it's called big stick diplomacy. And big stick diplomacy is talking about this African proverb that says, speak softly and carry a big stick. And basically what that means is we're going to go in and we're going to try to negotiate and speak softly and have conversations with you. But if you don't agree to the negotiations, we're going to go in and fight. And so that's kind of what that references. Then it's also called the Roosevelt corollary, because he kind of is again expanding the Monroe Doctrine, and he's saying the U.S. would intervene in affairs in any American republic. So he's talking about Latin America, and so he's basically saying, Europe, leave us alone, and if you don't leave us alone, like, one, that's going to cause conflict, but two, we've got this. We can go into Latin American countries using military force or power, and we're going to fix the problem because we are becoming a world power. In this picture to your right, you're going to see him obviously carrying his big stick diplomacy, and he's kind of leading a group of ships. And basically one of the things he did is it's called the Great White Fleet. And the Great White Fleet is where he actually sends ships out, our Navy, and they travel around the world, basically kind of setting a statement like the United States is expanding and kind of watch out for us. It's kind of him making a stand on who we are becoming. Then you also have the Caribbean Sea, because a lot of our involvements are going to be in that region, Latin America, Panama, and we want to control that for many reasons. Obviously resources, but we also want to control it for trade. So then you have William Taft, and William Taft, he's going to kind of promote more of a financial component, and he is going to be interested in economic interest. And so he's going to encourage U.S. bankers to aid debt-plagued governments. And that's essentially dollar diplomacy. So he kind of takes this big stick diplomacy with Roosevelt and kind of adds this piece to it. Like, it's important also to encourage the U.S. bankers to aid these debt-plagued countries to kind of help them in. Primarily, we're talking about Latin America and then Asia. And so you have that statement where it says continuation of the open door policy. And the open door policy is basically our dealings with Asia or China. And in China, what would have happened is you have China kind of broken up into regions by the European countries, and they were controlling those regions and trading with them. And the United States wanted to get involved in that international trade. Well, Roosevelt basically says that, hey, we're going to take this policy in regards to China, and we're going to trade with them. And all of these countries, he's kind of suggesting, hey, would you guys be willing to do this? Well, then a couple days later, essentially, Roosevelt comes back and says, everybody agreed with me, and so we're going to follow this open door policy. And really, nobody had agreed with him. So that also kind of tells you a little bit about Roosevelt's character. But Taft is going to kind of be have a continuation of that policy. And then lastly, you have moral diplomacy, which is Woodrow Wilson's policy. This also, you could, instead of moral diplomacy, you could put missionary diplomacy. And he kind of is using this diplomacy or foreign policy as a means to promote democratic governments and human rights, national integrity, and opportunity. So he's trying to do the right thing in Latin America. The one thing I will say about this is, so he wants to promote democratic governments and human rights, and he kind of claims that he's not going to use force, but he does use force. It says he's not opposed to use force in order to help Latin American countries do the right thing. He absolutely does use force multiple times in regards to his moral diplomacy or missionary diplomacy.